Shalom and welcome once again to Pearls of the Torah. I'm Moreh Matan, Pastor Matt McKeown, and I'm glad to be back with you this week. And we gather together every week to study the Torah, to dive into its depths, and I appreciate you being with me every week at this time. If you're new to this program, please subscribe to this channel and share this on your social media platforms so that as many people as possible can benefit from this teaching. This week, of course, we are in Parshat Vayeshev, and our thoughts tonight are entitled Joseph's Journey and Divine Providence. Joseph's Journey and Divine Providence. We, of course, are going to be continuing to look at the Or HaChaim and the special commentary that he has put together. Now, as a backdrop for the story of Joseph, we see Jacob's desire to settle in peace. We see this in Genesis chapter 37, verse 1, and it says, "And Jacob dwelt in the land where his father had sojourned, in the land of Canaan." Or HaChaim says that Jacob had desired to live in peace, but the turmoil surrounding Joseph arose instead. Or HaChaim explains that righteous people are not allowed to live in perfect tranquility in this world because it is a place of trials and spiritual refinement. This is part of God's design to elevate the righteous and prepare them for eternal reward. Something that I think that we need to remember is that when we are being tested in our lives, we need to remember that there is a lesson that we can learn from this. Of course, in his book, the Besorah, or the Good News According to COVID-19, Rabbi Shapira has a wonderful philosophy with that book, and that is, in the midst of that worldwide pandemic, rather than pray against the virus, we needed to be asking, Lord, what are you trying to teach us through this trial? And I think that's very wise. That's something that we really don't think of. We almost think that what we should do is sort of pray away any bad things or negative things or negative circumstances or traumatic events or things like that, when in reality, we really need to see what it is that God is trying to teach us through these types of things. So Jacob, of course, desired to live a life in peace after a life filled with challenges from Esau, Laban, of course, his sister Dinah's ordeal, or his daughter Dinah, rather, her ordeal. The Or HaChaim explains that this yearning was a natural human desire for rest. This is something that God puts within us, this desire for rest. And he also had this desire for stability in his life. So he longed for this, but it just wasn't to be. There was going to be more turmoil that would come in his life. And we see that, as I mentioned, trials elevate the soul and prepare the righteous for their eternal reward. So Joseph's story begins immediately after this verse, showing that Jacob's peace was interrupted by divine design. This is something that I think is quite interesting with the Torah. Sometimes the Torah is not in chronological order. It is here, but sometimes it's not in chronological order, but rather an order to see how one situation or one thing leads to another, or to put two things in the same context. Well, here we see that he has this desire for peace, for stability. He wanted this tranquility in his life, but all of a sudden this incident with Joseph begins. So it says there in verse 3, just a couple of verses later, "Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his sons because he was the son of his old age." The Or HaChaim discusses why Jacob's love for Joseph was greater than his other sons, and he attributes this to Joseph's unique spiritual qualities and his resemblance to himself, his resemblance to Jacob's righteousness and wisdom. And he saw in Joseph the continuation of his own legacy, which made him favor Joseph as a spiritual heir. We know, of course, in a natural sense, Joseph is the firstborn of the wife that he really wanted. He's the firstborn of Rachel. And so because of this, he is given a special status and he is treated as if he's the firstborn. So the Or HaChaim talks about Jacob's love for Joseph and notes that Jacob's affection was not merely because Joseph was born to him in his old age, but because there is a spiritual connection here. Of course, in our own children, we see that the qualities of both mother and father sometimes are evidenced a bit more with this child than in that one. It is interesting. I see in myself and my two brothers, I see qualities of both my mother and father in both of us, and sometimes not in equal measure. Some are more like the mother, some are more like the father. And the same is true with my own three children. Some, in some ways, they're more like my wife, and in some ways, they're more like me. And we will tend to identify with someone that is more like us in a certain way. And so this favoritism is, although it's not correct, it's not right, we understand where it's coming from. So Joseph, as we said, mirrored Jacob in righteousness and wisdom, and it made him like the chosen spiritual heir of Jacob. So we see not only the love for Joseph, but then we see an inheritance of legacy. Jacob saw in Joseph the continuity of the covenantal blessings given to Abraham and Isaac. And we also see a foreshadowing of leadership as far as Joseph's life and his position, his status as favorite, hinted at his future leadership over his family, a theme that is confirmed by his dreams. Now, let's look at this next section, which of course refers to Joseph's dreams and them being divine messages. In verse 5 of chapter 37, it says, "And Joseph dreamed a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more." The Or HaChaim says that Joseph's dreams were not merely personal aspirations, but divine revelations about his future role. Or HaChaim explains that Joseph's brothers misunderstood the dreams, perceiving them as arrogant rather than prophetic. The repetition of the dreams served as confirmation of their divine origin and their inevitability. Now, when we look at the nature of the dreams, the Or HaChaim emphasizes the divine origin of the dreams, which foretold of Joseph and his future role with the family. If you'll remember in his dreams, whether it was sheaves of grain or corn or the sun, moon, and stars bowing down to him, this, of course, is something that was prophetic. And as the Or HaChaim says, the repetition brings confirmation of the reality. Now, the Or HaChaim gives Joseph some credit here and says that it's not that Joseph shouldn't have told the dreams, but rather it is that the brothers misinterpreted the dreams. Their jealousy and their hatred blinded them to the spiritual significance of Joseph's visions. Now, of course, there is a divine purpose to these dreams, and the stage is set for the events that would lead to Joseph's descent into Egypt and then his ascent, which demonstrates God's providence in his life as he ascends to the second in command of the whole kingdom, of the whole country. Our next section here deals with the brothers' hatred. They say to him in verse 8 of chapter 37, "Will you indeed reign over us?" There is this questioning that they have. And the Or HaChaim says that the brothers' hatred was rooted in their belief that Joseph sought to usurp their spiritual inheritance. The Or HaChaim suggests that they viewed Joseph's behavior in dreams as attempts to claim superiority. However, they failed to recognize that the dreams were decrees from heaven rather than Joseph's personal ambition. This is something that we've got to remember. Just because this was revealed to Joseph that it was going to happen doesn't mean that Joseph caused it to happen or even wanted it to happen. It's just that this is God's plan for Joseph, and when it was made known to the brothers, they took it in a way that he was trying to make some personal advancement. So the root of the hatred, Or HaChaim explains, is in the brothers' animosity, which stemmed from their belief that Joseph sought to dominate them. not just that he was told by God that he would be in a position of leadership. And they saw him as a threat to their spiritual inheritance from their father. Now, the misjudgment of Joseph, as they failed to recognize that Joseph's role was divinely appointed, this is important for us to remember. This isn't something that they sought. It reminds me of King David replacing King Saul. This isn't something that David set out to do, to overthrow the king and the throne. This is something that God had chosen. And it was an appointment, a divine appointment. Now, the broader implications of this, the hatred of the brothers, it plays a role in God fulfilling his plan, even though it was driven by human emotion. This is something that I think is very important for us to remember, that God uses us as a way to get his purposes fulfilled. So even though we are acting from a human understanding, which is of course limited, he is working out his great purposes. Our next section here, of course, deals with Reuben's attempt to save Joseph. We see this in Genesis chapter 37, verse 22. Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood." Remember, the original plan was to kill him. But Reuben says, "Shed no blood, cast him into this pit in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him." Well, the Or HaChaim addresses this by saying that Reuben's intervention was motivated by his desire to rescue Joseph later. According to the rabbis, Reuben said, "Throw him in this pit," because Reuben was going to sneak away and rescue him out of the pit at a later time. But Or HaChaim highlights an even additional and deeper layer of this story, that divine providence was at work to ensure Joseph's survival. Reuben's suggestion to cast Joseph into the pit instead of killing him outright allowed God's plan to unfold without interference. He's got to get down to Egypt. And so how does that happen? How that happens is they throw him into a pit, and then of course they sell him, which is in our next point. So Reuben's motive was to return later and rescue Joseph, which is a commendable attitude. Now, Reuben's suggestion to use the pit instead of outright murder allowed Joseph's life to be spared, allowing God to work out his purposes. And God orchestrated events so that Joseph would survive and fulfill his destiny by being taken down into Egypt. Now, the significance of the pit becomes a symbol of Joseph's trials, which ultimately lead to his elevation. Remember, he was elevated in Potiphar's house, and then he is cast down into the pit, as it were, of the jail, of the dungeon, and then he is elevated again. You remember, the children of Israel go down into Egypt, and then they are elevated out with the Exodus. This is a common theme, this idea of exile and redemption, of galut and geulah, that happens all throughout the scriptures and all throughout the history of the people of Israel. Now, in verse 28 of chapter 37, we see the sale of Joseph, but divine providence also working out God's purposes here. It says, "And they sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver." Now, the sale of Joseph was orchestrated by God as a larger plan to bring Jacob's family to Egypt. Or HaChaim notes that the remarkable chain of events, emphasizing that even actions taken with malicious intent ultimately served divine purposes. Remember, Joseph even notices this. He says, "You meant this for evil, but God meant it for good." This reflects the principle that God's providence governs all human actions. So when we look at human choices versus the divine plan, the Or HaChaim stresses that the brothers' actions, though malicious, were part of God's design to bring Jacob's family down into Egypt. So it's not that we don't choose, it's not that we don't have free will, but it's also not that if we have free will, God is not sovereign. It's a bit of both. It is their malicious intent that caused them to do this, but God is using that to work things out for good. This is, of course, something that we see with Rav Shaul in the Brit Chadashah, of things being worked out for good if we are loving God and being called according to his purpose. We see a chain of events here. The sale of Joseph sets the stage for the fulfillment of the covenantal promise made to Abraham regarding his descendants in a foreign land, all the way back in Genesis chapter 15, verse 13. We also see the symbolism of the silver. The pieces of silver highlight the materialistic motives of the brothers, contrasting with Joseph's spiritual destiny. And then as we wrap up today, our last 2 points, we see Judah's role in the sale. In verse 26 of chapter 37, Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is there if we kill our brother and cover up his blood?" Judah's suggestion to sell Joseph instead of killing him was a pivotal moment. The Or HaChaim comments that Judah's intervention stemmed from a mixture of moral reasoning and self-interest. Nevertheless, his actions played a critical role in fulfilling God's plan, just as Reuben's did, showing how human choices are woven into the fabric of divine providence. Now, we see Judah's intervention, his suggestion to sell Joseph, reflects a pragmatic approach, and it avoids murder. So he's avoiding something evil, but he's also profiting from the sale. So there's a dual thing happening here. I'm not going to do something murderous, but I'm also going to profit from the sale of my own brother. So we have a moral complexity that's happening here that the Or HaChaim notes Judah's mix of moral reasoning and self-interest, showcasing the human tendency toward compromise. Now, it is those little compromises in our life that lead to big problems. That's exactly what's happening here. The compromise of, I'm going to make money off my brother, but I'm not going to kill him. Now, a key role we have in the narrative, as far as Judah's role, his decision leads to Joseph's descent into Egypt, demonstrating how human actions align with God's will. As we've said, the sovereignty of God. And of course, later on in future generations, when we look at Pharaoh and the hardening of his heart, the strengthening of his heart, as it says there, using the word chazak, we have talked about this many, many times. Jacob's reaction to Joseph's appearance, and here is where we will finish up our thoughts today. Genesis chapter 37, verse 35, all his sons and daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. Jacob's refusal to be comforted stemmed from an inner sense that Joseph was still alive. Now, remember, Rabbi Shapira has taught us that in the Hebrew where it says, go down to Egypt, we've heard that there's grain in Egypt, that this word that's there can be translated, I've heard that there's a sun in Egypt. I've heard, we know that there's a sun there, that there's a hidden meaning there, that Jacob never lost hope in Joseph being alive. So the Or HaChaim explains that mourning for the dead is eventually eased by divine decree, but Jacob's grief persisted because Joseph had not actually died. This highlights the deep spiritual connection between Jacob and Joseph. What's basically being said here is there is a period of mourning that we have, grieving when someone that we love dies. But eventually that pain eases as time goes on. But it never happened with Jacob. It never got any easier. And that's because Joseph never really died. And so this pain continues with him. So this persistent grief is explained by Or HaChaim. This refusal to be comforted stemmed from an inner sense that Joseph was still alive. Now, we've heard about this many times in personal anecdotes and narratives from people where a parent just knew that their child was still alive, or a parent just knew that hope was gone, that their child that is missing had died. There's some sort of connection between family members, especially parents and children, that we see evidenced here. Now, we also see a spiritual connection, that Jacob's bond with Joseph is profound, and it transcended ordinary parental love, but it was rooted in their shared spiritual destiny. And so there's this spiritual connection that Jacob feels. He's just not dead. I don't believe that he's dead, even though he, takes the account of the brothers. Now, there's a foreshadowing of a reunion. Jacob's unresolved grief hints at the eventual restoration of family in Egypt. This is so interesting to me, the way that there is this foreshadowing, this unresolved grief. It's almost like we're watching a movie, we're watching a film. It's almost as if there is a destined reunion. And that is something that, of course, can give us comfort. I have recently, in the last month or so, participated in 2 different memorial services. And whenever as a pastor I do this kind of thing to celebrate someone's memory or their life, to do a funeral or a memorial service or a celebration of life, it's always difficult because you have mourning family members. And it's also difficult because these 2 services that I've been a part of recently were for people that I knew. And that always makes it especially difficult. But the comfort that we have is that there will be a reunion. Just as Jacob held out hope for a family reunion someday, we know that we will have a reunion if we have our lives right with the Lord, that there will be a great reunion at the resurrection of the dead. And that is where we put our hope. We don't want to mourn and grieve as those who have no hope, as it says in the Brit Hadashah. We need to have that hope because we see the light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. We see the hope there in the distance of this great reunion at the resurrection. I hope and pray that this Torah study this evening has been a blessing to you. And I want you to look at the life and the trials of Joseph as a mirror of your own spiritual life. Of descent always leads to ascent. If you feel like you're really down in the dumps, if you really feel like you have been put down by life, well, look out, because an elevation is on the way. But be prepared that the going down, the descending, if you will, be prepared to learn something in that moment. That it's not necessarily some punishment that's happening, but it is a refining, it is a trial. Remember what the Or HaChaim said at the top of this study, that for the righteous, there is no real peace that happens, that life is filled with challenges. Jacob desired to settle in peace, but the Or HaChaim says that this yearning is natural, this human desire for rest and stability, but this world for the righteous is a place of spiritual trial and refinement. So just keep that in mind. If you're going through a trial, you're in good company. Not only with Jacob and Joseph, but with Rav Shaul, with Paul, with Peter, with the other apostles, with the women that were leaders in the congregations, with Yeshua himself. Thank you so much for joining me. And my prayer for you is that you have a wonderful week as we are looking forward to Hanukkah. And please order Hanukkah in the light of Mashiach and pay attention to our Hanukkah broadcasts, which will happen, of course, next week. Thank you so very much for joining me. Shalom.